When The Simpsons put Donald Trump in the Oval Office back in 2000, it was a punchline. A cartoon gag. Nobody in that writer's room could have guessed that 16 years later, the joke would become the headline of the decade. That single moment turned a silly yellow cartoon into something people now treat like a crystal ball. Every few months, another clip resurfaces online, another fan points at the screen and says, "Wait, they called this too?" And once you start looking, you cannot stop finding them. Black holes swallowing towns. Babies whose cries get translated by machines. Flying cars parked in driveways. Holograms standing in hospital rooms. It almost feels less like coincidence and more like the show has been quietly sketching out our future one absurd episode at a time. So today, we are pulling apart the strangest, funniest, and most unsettling predictions from Springfield, lining them up next to what is actually happening in the world right now, and asking the question everyone eventually asks. Is this just clever writing catching lucky guesses, or is there something genuinely eerie about how often this show gets it right? Stick around, because by the end of this, you might start watching old reruns very differently. Long-running cartoons love a good disaster episode, and The Simpsons has never been shy about ending the world for laughs. In one of its Halloween specials, Springfield builds itself a subatomic particle collider, the kind of giant scientific toy real physicists use to smash tiny particles into each other at incredible speeds. Naturally, nothing goes right. The machine fires up, two particles collide, and out pops a miniature black hole sitting quietly in the middle of town. Lisa, being Lisa, immediately understands the danger and begs everyone to leave it alone. Naturally, nobody listens. Instead, the family treats it like a novelty trash can. Homer even launches a small business out of it, charging neighbors to toss their garbage into the void. It is exactly the kind of short-sighted, profit-first thinking you would expect from Springfield, and exactly the kind of thing that makes the ending inevitable. The hole grows, and eventually the entire town gets pulled in. It plays as a goofy, over-the-top gag, but the premise is not as far removed from real physics as it seems. Particle colliders are real machines, and the largest one on Earth, the Large Hadron Collider, really does exist to smash particles together at close to the speed of light. Scientists have spent years explaining, patiently and repeatedly, that the tiny theoretical black holes those experiments might produce would be far too small and far too short-lived to swallow so much as a teacup, let alone a town. But the idea has stuck in the public imagination anyway, resurfacing every time the collider gets restarted or upgraded. Meanwhile, actual astronomers keep finding stranger and stranger black holes out in the universe, some absurdly massive, some sitting in surprisingly nearby corners of our galaxy, some challenging what scientists thought they understood about how these objects form in the first place. None of them are coming for Springfield, or for us. But the show's cartoonish fear of a science experiment spiraling out of human control still taps into something real, a public that is fascinated by physics but never quite sure it trusts the people running the experiments. Parenthood comes with one universal complaint: babies cannot tell you what is wrong. They just cry, and you are left guessing between hunger, exhaustion, a wet diaper, or something you will never figure out. Decades ago, the show imagined a fix. In an early episode, Homer's long-lost half-brother invents a machine that claims to translate a baby's babbling into real words, turning goo goo gaga into an actual sentence an exhausted parent could understand. At the time, it was a throwaway invention gag, one of dozens of ridiculous gadgets the show has dreamed up over the years. Except the idea of decoding an infant's cries is not nearly as silly as it sounds, and researchers have genuinely tried to build something close to it. The logic makes sense. Babies do not cry randomly. Their cries carry patterns, differences in pitch and rhythm and duration depending on whether they are hungry, in pain, tired, or simply want attention. Feed enough recordings of those cries into pattern recognition software, pair it with facial expression and movement tracking, and you start to get something that can make an educated guess at what an infant needs. Smart baby monitors have moved in this exact direction, promising parents an extra layer of insight beyond simply, the baby is crying, again. Some also try to flag unusual patterns that might be worth mentioning to a pediatrician, on the theory that atypical cries can sometimes be an early signal worth a second look. None of this technology replaces a parent's instinct, and no gadget is going to hand you a perfect translation the way Herb's fictional invention did on screen. But the core idea, that machines could listen more carefully to the sounds only babies make and hand parents a useful nudge, has quietly gone from a punchline to a genuine product category. Flying cars are the oldest promise of the future there is. Every decade insists they are right around the corner, and every decade quietly moves the goalposts. The Simpsons poked fun at this exact obsession in an episode where Homer gets his hands on one, and, in classic Homer fashion, immediately turns Springfield skies into a hazard zone. It is a broad, silly episode built entirely around the absurdity of trusting Homer Simpson with an aircraft, but underneath the jokes is a very real question that engineers have been chasing for 100 years. Could an ordinary vehicle actually switch between road and sky? That question has inched closer to a real answer. Small teams of engineers around the world have built prototype vehicles that genuinely can drive on pavement and then unfold wings to become a functioning aircraft, flying real test flights rather than just rendering concept videos. They are not yet the mass-market flying commute machines that science fiction promised, and they will not be for a long time. The price tags land firmly in luxury sports car territory, sometimes higher, and pilots still need proper flight training and licensing on top of a regular driver's license, which is its own significant investment of time and money. Even so, the fact that working prototypes now exist, with real test flights logged and real wait lists of buyers from multiple countries, says something. The joke of, what if Homer had a flying car, has quietly become, what if a small number of wealthy early adopters actually do, which is a much narrower gap between fiction and reality than most people expected. One of the show's stranger episodes has Bart and his friends thrown into a manufactured boy band, complete with an image, a hit single, and screaming fans. The twist is that the band was never really about music. It was built as a recruitment tool, with a hidden backward message buried in the song urging listeners to enlist. It is an absurd, cartoonish idea, but it pokes at a real anxiety that has followed pop culture for decades. The fear that entertainment is never just entertainment, that somewhere behind the catchy hook is an agenda you did not agree to. You do not need hidden backward messages for that fear to feel current. Modern marketing has gotten extremely good at using music, personality, and short-form video to make messaging feel like discovery rather than advertising. Ordinary people with modest but devoted followings are now paid to fold products, causes, and campaigns naturally into their content, precisely because audiences trust a familiar face more than an obvious ad. Even institutions that used to rely on formal advertising campaigns, including military recruiters, have leaned into gaming culture, live stream personalities, and online communities to reach younger audiences in spaces that do not feel like recruitment offices. None of this involves anything as cartoonish as a hidden backward message. It does not need to. The influence the episode joked about, the idea that the songs and personalities you enjoy are quietly shaping what you think and want, has simply moved out of fiction and into an entire, openly acknowledged industry. Long before artificial intelligence became a phrase you would hear on the evening news, the show ran an episode set inside a theme park full of animatronic characters, the kind of robotic mascots you would expect at any big amusement park. A malfunction turns the mascots hostile, and the family spends the rest of the episode trying to survive an attraction that was supposed to be harmless fun. It was written as a straightforward horror comedy parody of theme park culture, nothing more. Watching it now lands differently, because the broader anxiety it plays with, machines behaving in ways their designers never intended, has become one of the defining conversations in technology. As artificial intelligence systems have grown more capable, researchers and engineers have spent increasing amounts of time and money specifically studying how these systems might act unpredictably and how to build in safeguards before deployment rather than after something goes wrong. Robots used in security, hospitality, and public-facing roles occasionally do malfunction in ways that make headlines, usually due to ordinary software bugs or sensor errors rather than anything resembling the deliberate malice the episode imagines. Serious researchers in the field have been increasingly vocal about wanting stronger safety testing and oversight built into powerful AI systems before they reach wide use, precisely because a system that is difficult to fully understand is also a system that is difficult to fully trust. The episode's version of the fear is exaggerated and cartoonish on purpose. The underlying worry it is joking about, that we might build something we do not fully understand how to control, is one that a lot of very serious people are taking very seriously right now. In one episode set in the future, Bart receives a message from an older version of Lisa, who has become president, and the message arrives as a glowing, three-dimensional projection rather than a phone call or a video chat. In 2000, that was pure science fiction shorthand, a quick visual way to say, this is the future, without dwelling on how it worked. Hologram-style technology has since moved from movie magic into working demonstrations and early consumer products. Researchers have built tabletop displays capable of projecting three-dimensional images into open air without requiring the viewer to wear any headset or special glasses, a real technical achievement that used to only exist in concept art. Video calling hardware aimed at making a remote person appear as a lifelike three-dimensional presence in the room with you has moved from research labs into product announcements, chasing the exact fantasy of, "it feels like they're actually here," that the episode joked about decades ago. The application that matters most, though, is happening in medicine. Surgeons have begun using three-dimensional holographic projections of a patient's anatomy during complex procedures, giving them a clearer, more spatial view of exactly what they are working on than a flat screen can provide. It is a genuinely useful tool, not a gimmick, and it is a strange full-circle moment. An image once used purely as a punchline about the distant future is now sitting in operating rooms helping doctors save lives in the present. The most famous prediction of them all remains the Trump presidency itself, first joked about in an episode from the year 2000 that imagined a chaotic future America. At the time, putting a brash reality television businessman in the Oval Office was meant to read as an over-the-top gag, a symbol of just how absurd politics could theoretically get. 16 years later, that gag became the news. The same episode, and later ones exploring the same fictional future timeline, also floated the idea of political dynasties extending well beyond a single term, drawing loosely on the same pattern America has already seen play out with families like the Kennedys and the Bushes. It is not a stretch to imagine a show built on satire continuing to circle that idea, wondering aloud whether a well-known political family name might carry weight into future election cycles. Whether that particular thread of the joke ever lines up with reality the way the original 2000 prediction did is impossible to know in advance. That is precisely why people keep watching so closely. The show already beat the odds once on this exact topic, and nobody wants to be the one who dismissed it too early. Space travel gets its own strange spotlight in an episode where Lisa joins a private company promising ordinary people a future living on Mars. The show does not play it entirely straight, either. It pokes fun at the idea of turning space exploration into a marketing opportunity, showing astronaut suits plastered in sponsor logos and mission funding partly coming from a reality television deal. It is satire aimed squarely at commercialization, imagining a future where even the Moon and Mars are not immune to advertising. That satire landed closer to reality than the writers probably expected. Private companies are now genuinely central to the modern space industry in a way that would have seemed unusual a generation ago, funding missions partly through commercial spaceflight contracts, merchandise, and enormous public interest in live-streamed launches. Ambitions of eventually sending people to Mars are no longer confined to government space agencies. They are now openly stated goals of private space companies as well, even if the actual timelines keep slipping further into the future than early announcements suggested, which is its own long tradition in the space industry. National space agencies have been taking smaller, incremental steps toward that same eventual goal, treating renewed lunar missions as a stepping stone toward a much later human mission to Mars. The emotional core of the episode, a family wrestling with the fear and excitement of a loved one signing up for a genuinely dangerous, genuinely unprecedented journey, is likely to become a very real conversation happening in real households once crewed missions to Mars actually become realistic. The show got there first, sponsor logos and all. Another glimpse of an imagined future shows Homer and Marge lounging around wearing headsets, sipping what looks like a milkshake but is entirely virtual, a joke about a future where entertainment and even meals have become fully digital. It reads as a throwaway sight gag, a quick visual shorthand for everything has gone virtual now, even food. Virtual and augmented reality dining experiments have genuinely popped up since then, layering visuals, sound, and sometimes sent onto real meals to change how they are perceived, on the theory that a huge part of taste is actually about context and expectation rather than the food itself. Some experimental setups go further, pairing virtual reality headsets with devices designed to simulate smell or texture, chasing an experience that gets closer to fully digital eating without any real food involved at all. There are genuinely thoughtful applications buried in this research too. People with dietary restrictions or allergies can, in some experimental setups, safely experience the sensory side of a food they could never actually eat. Educational projects have used similar technology to let people simulate tasting things that would be impossible or unethical to try in real life, as a way of building empathy or awareness around subjects like endangered species and food ethics. Nobody is replacing real meals with headsets anytime soon. The technology remains a novelty far more than a lifestyle. But the core joke, that a plate of virtual food could someday feel almost as satisfying as a real one, is no longer pure fantasy. The 2007 feature film built its entire plot around an environmental disaster, with Homer accidentally polluting the town's lake so badly that the federal government's response is to trap all of Springfield under a massive glass dome to contain the damage. It plays as broad, exaggerated comedy, A small-town mistake blown up into a giant, absurd government overreaction, but the fear sitting underneath it, that pollution and climate damage might eventually force genuinely drastic government intervention, is not exaggerated at all. Nobody is building literal glass domes over cities, but the underlying instinct the movie was joking about, drawing a hard boundary between cleaner air and polluted air, already exists in a quieter, more bureaucratic form. Several major cities have created low-emission or restricted zones where higher-polluting vehicles face fees or outright bans, effectively creating invisible dividing lines between cleaner and dirtier air, exactly the kind of separation the movie exaggerated into a physical dome. Climate scientists have spent years warning that global temperatures are climbing toward thresholds that were once considered a distant, worst-case scenario, and that crossing them raises the odds of more severe flooding, heat waves, and disruption to food and water supplies. Governments in multiple countries have set increasingly ambitious targets for cutting emissions and shifting to cleaner electricity, precisely because the alternative is the kind of chaotic, resource-strained future the film satirized. The film's central gag, that one town's carelessness could force an extreme, all-encompassing government response, is obviously an exaggeration when told through Homer Simpson polluting a lake. But as a metaphor for how climate change might eventually force stricter and stricter interventions on ordinary life, it holds up uncomfortably well. Decades before any of its more famous predictions, one of the show's earliest specials imagined nuclear paranoia boiling over into farce, with Homer waking his family in a panic over a fake war that never actually started. It was a direct, obvious parody of Cold War anxiety, poking fun at how deeply that fear had embedded itself into ordinary American households of the era. That specific fear, of a sudden nuclear escalation between major world powers, never fully disappeared. It simply changed which nations people worry about, shifting from the old Cold War rivalry toward newer sources of tension between major global and regional powers. Symbolic measures like the doomsday clock, maintained by a group of scientists to represent how close humanity is judged to be to global catastrophe, have moved. Some countries have quietly reintroduced or expanded civil defense planning, a category of preparation that had mostly faded from public life in the decades after the original Cold War ended. None of this means a global conflict is imminent, and treating old comedy sketches as literal prophecy is always a mistake. But the specific anxiety Homer was parodying, ordinary families half-joking, half-genuinely worrying about a war breaking out with little warning, has clearly not gone anywhere. It just found a new set of headlines to attach itself to. A Halloween special from 2009 imagines an entire town transformed by a viral outbreak that starts, unsettlingly, with a fast food burger made from cattle that were fed other cattle, an ingredient choice a news anchor eats on live television right before turning into a flesh-eating monster. It is exaggerated for maximum horror comedy effect, but the specific detail buried inside the joke, cattle being fed other cattle, is not invented nonsense. It is a direct, deliberate reference to a real agricultural practice from the 1980s that was later linked to a genuine and serious disease outbreak in cattle, one that caused lasting changes to food safety regulations. The episode takes a real historical food safety failure and pushes it into full zombie horror territory, using it as the spark for total societal collapse. An earlier episode from 1993 takes a more grounded approach to a similar fear, imagining a flu-like illness spreading from a factory overseas into Springfield through ordinary international shipping, arriving on completely mundane consumer goods rather than anything exotic. The episode plays the resulting chaos, panic buying, overwhelmed hospitals, and finger-pointing over who caused the outbreak, largely for laughs, but the mechanism it describes, an illness spreading rapidly along the same supply chains that move ordinary products around the globe, is a very real and well-understood way that infectious disease actually travels in an interconnected world. Anyone who lived through a real global health crisis will recognize the beats almost immediately. The empty shelves, the overwhelmed hospitals, the search for who or what to blame. The show did not need to predict a specific virus to get the shape of a modern outbreak right. It just needed to understand how tightly connected global supply chains and human panic already were, decades before most people were paying close attention to either. A more grounded episode has Lisa build a solar-powered car for a school competition, and for a while, she is winning. Then, almost cruelly, a large blimp drifts overhead at exactly the wrong moment, casting a shadow over her car and cutting off its power source just before the finish line. It is a small, quiet joke, nowhere near as dramatic as black holes or nuclear panic, but it works as a surprisingly sharp metaphor for the modern relationship between renewable energy and the industries it threatens to replace. Solar power has become dramatically cheaper and more efficient over the past decade, to the point where it is now one of the most cost-competitive sources of new electricity in large parts of the world, a shift that seemed unlikely just a generation ago. That growth has not gone unchallenged. Established energy industries have, at various points, funded advertising and lobbying campaigns aimed at slowing the public and political momentum behind renewables, protecting existing business models the same way any established industry defends its market share. Lisa's blimp is not a perfect metaphor, and nobody is literally blocking solar panels with airships. But the underlying idea that a genuinely promising hard-won advantage can be quietly undercut by a much larger, more powerful force at the worst possible moment describes the real tension around renewable energy adoption almost exactly. Sometimes the smallest, quietest joke in the show ends up saying the most. None of this means The Simpsons is secretly a prophecy machine, and it would be a mistake to treat cartoon punchlines as literal forecasts of the future. What the show has always been genuinely excellent at is something more grounded than fortune-telling, paying close attention to the direction the world was already leaning, then exaggerating that direction into a joke. A show that runs for decades, staffed by sharp, well-informed writers constantly riffing on politics, science, and culture, is going to occasionally land on ideas that eventually happen to come true, simply by the law of large numbers. But knowing the mechanism behind the magic trick does not make it any less fun to watch play out. Every few months, another old clip resurfaces, another headline lines up a little too neatly with a punchline from 20 years ago, and the internet does what it always does. It points, it laughs, and it wonders, just for a second, whether Springfield knows something the rest of us do not. Which of these predictions do you think is the strangest? Drop your pick in the comments, and if you want more deep dives chasing down the real stories behind the internet's favorite conspiracy cartoon, make sure you are subscribed, because Springfield is clearly not done predicting the future yet.